All right, since you haven't been to the Trask, it is located in Northwest Oregon. Can folks hear me okay? This microphone's not really at my level. So located up here in Northwest Oregon, it's one of 3 watersheds that are being studied as part of the Watersheds Research Cooperative. It's a coalition of researchers here at Oregon State University. The first in this series of studies was the Hinkle Creek watershed study. That's been going on for over a decade, just wrapped up this year. The second was the Alsea watershed study, which is a revisit of work that was started in the 1950s by Jim Hall and his colleagues, so they're going back in after the second cut of the study and looking at how streams and fish habitat are affected by harvest, contemporary forest harvest. And the Trask is the third and final in this series, I believe, started in 2007 is when we started our work, and we'll be continuing for the next 10 years. I'd like to mention that this land in the Trask watershed is owned by Weyerhaeuser, Oregon Department of Forestry, and of course Bureau of Land Management, and they cooperate to work with us, the researchers, with USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, Forest Service, Oregon State University, and provide a lot of the funding that we get for this work. So I'd like to acknowledge that. So what we're trying to do is look at contemporary forest practices. So this is an example of what happened back in the day with the original Alsea watershed study. It was pretty hard on streams, pretty hard on fish and fish habitat. And now we tried to take our forest harvest out of the riparian zones and up onto the hill slopes, and we've become more interested in downstream effects of upstream forest harvest on fish-bearing streams and fish. So this is what we're looking at now in this series of studies here in Western Oregon. So I'll zoom in to the Trask watershed itself just to kind of show you how this thing is laid out. It's a fairly small watershed, although it is the biggest of the 3 that are being studied, and it's located in the headwaters of the Trask. We have 16 headwater units. These are the little polygons located here up along the ridge tops of this basin. These are small streams that are not fish-bearing, and these are the locations of where the timber will be harvested next year. Downstream of these 16 headwater sites, we've got 4 downstream fish sites. So we've got one here, 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 here. 3 of these basins will be harvested. This one, Pothole Creek, Gus Creek, the upper main stem of the South Fork of the Trask. And then this watershed here, Rock Creek, is going to remain unharvested throughout the duration of the study. So we can take a look at what happens in these headwaters and how that translates downstream to affect fish in places where we're going to harvest and places where we won't. Here's the schedule. Like I said, we started in 2000. We've been monitoring up to 2011, actually, when the watershed now is being prepped for harvest. Next summer, 2012, we're going to try to stay out of there while they're taking the trees out. And then we've got some work ahead of us, 2013 up to at least 2016, post-harvest monitoring after the trees are taken out. Been quite a challenge to keep this funded. But anyhow, pretty long-term study. The monitoring approach, we are focusing on coastal cutthroat trout. Coastal cutthroat trout is the most prevalent species. It's present in all 4 of the sites that we're studying in pretty good numbers, although it may not be the most abundant fish in the Trask, and I'll talk about that in a second. We're trying to combine detailed observation and experiments to understand process, to understand how things work in the Trask before we try to interpret what the effects of forestry might be, and then sort of some classic before-after monitoring for pattern. So we want to understand what has changed potentially after harvest and why did it change. And another question we faced when we got into this work was when to do it. When should we do the work? It was pretty easy for me to decide. The first time I went in there was November, and we had 3 feet of snow. So I thought, well, what about the summer? And it actually kind of makes sense because the summer is a period when discharge is at its lowest in this system. It may be actually pretty low in the summer, but oftentimes we see our low flows in the Coast Range in the late summer, early fall. We know that aquatic prey availability decreases, and this is a per capita decrease in terms of a consumer like fish, because most of the fish in these systems are born in the spring, so we have lots of small fish and surviving adults and juveniles, and so they deplete the prey resources in theory all the way through the fall when you see this low period of abundance of prey. So this could be an ecological crunch. It's a pretty important time to think about the effects of forestry. So that's sort of a conceptual model of why we should work during that time of the year and why that should be a crunch period, but we needed to validate that with some of these process studies. This graph just shows per capita prey availability basically through the season. This is for coastal cutthroat trout. For small trout, the solid symbols here being fish less than 100 millimeters long, and the open symbol is being cutthroat trout greater than 100 millimeters. And you can see that prey availability is relatively high in terms of consumption by individual fish in the spring, dropping in July, and then reaching a low in September for the seasons that we looked at least. And you can see that fish larger than 100 millimeters are dropping slightly faster than these smaller fish. If we look at in-stream cover, this is a master's thesis by Heidi Anderson. We find that in-stream cover is also very limited during this low flow season. So stream flows are fairly low, and so fish can't move around that very much, so they have to hide from predators. And what Heidi found was that a lot of things we think of as cover, like turbulence, undercut banks, large wood, were just not present in this system. And that fish primarily had to rely on substrate, mainly larger cobbles and boulders for cover. And a lot of this system where she looked, she didn't find cover at all. Most of the system could not provide cover for these larger coastal cutthroat trout bigger than 100 millimeters. If you look at seasonal survival in these systems, it's at a low during the late summer, early fall. This is work by Aaron Berger looking at survival over 3 annual cycles in Hinkle Creek. This is not in the Trask, but we believe this is happening there as well, and I'll show you some evidence for that in a second. But anyhow, during this time of the year, this low flow, late summer, early fall survival is really at a low. It jumps up back in the winter and spring, drops down again, jumps up, drops down again, fairly predictably over 3 annual cycles. So with that evidence in hand, we were pretty confident in thinking that the low flow was indeed a crunch period for larger coastal cutthroat trout, at least in terms of food limitation, limited refuge, limited cover, and low survival. We think of other species like juvenile coho salmon, for example, having a tough time in the winter. In the case for cutthroat trout, it's this time of year, the late summer, early fall, that is tough for them. Actually, they're probably pretty happy right now with this recent rain. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our monitoring approach. So that's just trying to understand some of the process, what's going on there. I'll go back to more process in a second. What we've done in these 4 fish-bearing sites that are downstream of these headwater harvest areas is set them up in the late summer, so from late July through the middle of September. We put in weirs with 2-way fish traps, and we pit tag fish. These are little transponders that we insert inside of the fish so we can individually identify them and track their movements. So we have these fish in between these weirs that are pit tagged, so we know who's going in, who's going out, and the identity of each individual. And this is pretty intense monitoring. It goes on over a 250-meter reach, pretty long reach of stream, immediately downstream of these harvest areas for that basically 6-week period. From that, we can estimate how many fish are present in these sites with a pretty high degree of accuracy. But not only that, we can break fish abundance down into its basic components. So birth, immigration, which should increase numbers, and death and emigration, which should decrease numbers. So trying to look at all 4 pieces of that full demographic equation, not just looking at the net result of these processes and saying, well, something changed. Well, what changed down here that affected abundance? That's what we want to know through this monitoring. And if you look at what we have so far, this is just data up to 2009. The same pattern persists through 2010. We see pretty highly variable patterns of abundance for small fish, so 50 to 99 millimeter coastal cutthroat trout. And there doesn't seem to be any pattern in terms of places or times in terms of years. But if you look at larger fish, you see this stream here, Gus Creek, tends to have more large fish, and that's a pattern that's fairly consistent from year to year. And you can see that these streams tend to sort of clump together in terms of showing a consistent spatial pattern. So more variability in abundance for small fish, persistent spatial pattern of abundance, which is nice for kind of looking at that pre-post-harvest comparison. And larger fish, for whatever reason, tend to be more abundant in Gus Creek. So we'll take a look at birth. That's that first component of abundance. This is a little bit difficult to interpret. If you look at the cumulative frequency distribution in terms of size of these fish, basically you don't see any fish that are less than 65 millimeters in some of these headwater streams during years that are fairly cold, like 2008. So in some years we see an asynchronous pattern of recruitment. These fish in the upper main stem trask aren't coming out of the gravel until later in September, coming out very small, less than 30 millimeters long, probably going to face a pretty tough winter. Whereas these fish downstream are up by the time we're out in late July for sampling. So asynchronous recruitment is sort of the biggest pattern we've seen. And that probably contributes to variability that we see in abundance from year to year for those smaller fish, with the bigger fish being more consistent. So now we'll take a look at immigration and emigration, how that plays out in these sites. Again, we've got those weirs. We know who's coming in, who's leaving. And of the proportion of fish that we tag at the beginning of our monitoring period, this shows the numbers of fish that stayed in the black and numbers of fish that moved, either left or either came in or came out during that time period. And we found that immigration and emigration are roughly equal during this time period, and there's no upstream or downstream pattern in terms of either side of the weirs for our sites. What you see is further up, Upper Main and Gus Creek, there seems to be less movement, sort of a stronger pattern of residency. And lower down in the network here in Pothole and Rock Creek, a few more fish move, but not that many. So immigration, emigration, movement doesn't seem to really be that big of a deal in terms of the demographic equation. Okay, now we'll talk about the final piece of the equation, of course, survival. I'll be a little bit more positive here. We have estimated survival probabilities based on our tag recaptures in these sites for all the years that we've monitored. And what you see basically is a pretty variable pattern of survival for small fish, intermediate sized fish, and larger, although there is a slight suggestion of size-biased mortality. This is pretty consistent with what Aaron Berger saw in Hinkle Creek, that is, larger fish have a lower chance of surviving through this low water period. Okay, so we're not just monitoring populations, we're also looking at food webs. And we've got a whole team of scientists out in the Trask looking at all kinds of things like organic matter, nutrient availability, temperature, riparian vegetation, light, geology, soils, stream flow, primary production, amphibians and vertebrates, and even one study on birds. And here I am in the stream trying to monitor fish and amphibians, these top predators in the system. And we can think of this system in terms of bottom-up influences. That is, if we bring the appropriate temperatures, the appropriate habitat that these animals need, the food production that they should be happy, right? If we give them everything that they need, that's sort of the prevailing sort of paradigm for thinking about impacts of forestry on fish in streams. But alternatively, it's quite possible that we may see what I call consumer regulation, that is, interactions among these top predators in the streams that could be very important. So coastal cutthroat trout being a very common top predator in the Trask, sculpins, which are quite numerous, which I'll talk about in a second, and also Pacific giant salamander, which can be the dominant component of biomass in some of these systems. These guys are fairly uncommon in the Trask in the fish-bearing portions of the network, but like in the Cascades, they can be the dominant predator. So I'm just going to talk about cutthroat trout and sculpins here. And the reason I think that consumer regulation could be important is we see astounding numbers of sculpins in these systems. So it may not just be a bottom-up deal, and your expectations should be conditioned on the impacts that these species might have on these systems. This is just a shot of abundance from the first year that we were in there in 2006, just looking at the catch among 35 sites that we sampled in the Trask initially just to figure out what was going on. And as expected, most of these are juvenile trout. A lot of these fish will die before the winter. In terms of larger fish, sculpins were the most abundant. And we know that our capture probability for sculpins is extremely low. It's less than 10%. It's more likely 5%. So if you think of this bar sort of extending, by a factor of 10 or probably even more, we have thousands of sculpins in the system. And we just completed a study this year to get a better estimate of what those numbers are going to be. We don't know yet. So they're likely by far, by an order of magnitude, the most abundant fish in this system. And they outnumber trout in 3 of the 4 streams. Gus Creek, that one that has a persistent pattern of larger fish, things seem to be happier there for cutthroat trout, has almost no sculpins. The rest have very high levels of sculpins. They have partial diet overlap with trout. Mark Reagan studied that for his master's thesis. They are less food limited than trout during the low flow season, and they're nocturnal, so you never see them during the daytime. They're out at night, so kind of a mystery species. So like I said, we're working on trying to get population estimates, getting numbers, biomass, trying to estimate productivity and ultimately energy flow through these different vertebrates in this headwater system to see how important consumer regulation is versus bottom-up effects. And ultimately, we hope to use this data to simulate species interactions. And the other thing that I'll mention here is we're not even sure what species we have in the system. They're very difficult to identify. We have riffle and reticulate sculpins, if you know the fish, and they're almost impossible to tell apart in the field. So we sent some samples down to Humboldt State University to get a genetic identification. So bottom lines, just wanted to emphasize in this presentation the importance of dissecting demography. So thinking about movement, recruitment, and survival, and also thinking about these systems as food webs, like Bob mentioned, not only thinking about sort of food web structure, ecosystem metabolism, sort of those bottom-up effects, but also thinking about this in terms of interactions among consumers, which could be very important in terms of controlling what we see happening out there on the ground and perhaps responses to forestry. Okay, final point, monitoring alone is insufficient. I think it's really important to roll in some of this understanding of process as you're trying to count fish during your monitoring, looking at effects of any kind of land use on them. And a lot of times we talk about this in terms of statistical power. I would argue that understanding biological processes is probably more important than statistical power, and I think we've learned that in the Trask. Thanks.